At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me. Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day, I must be on my way, because it is who comes in the name of the Lord." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
All right, so the last week and throughout Lent, Stephen has been taking pieces of our opening service and reflecting on them. So today I want you to hear the verse that we're focusing on. We are created to experience joy in communion with God, to love one another, and to live in harmony with creation. So here's a little known fact about me. One year, I spent multiple days jumping in a hole in the frozen lake in the winter. Why? That is the question. Anybody else? It has a term now called cold plunging, but anybody else like to jump in a cold lake or get in the snow after being really hot? The Snow Angel Challenge happened here, but this was another level. So when I was on internship in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is very cold in the winters, and we went even further north, we would go on, so this is when I was internship as a pastor. I spent a full year at this church. They went on retreats quite a bit, and so they took their middle schoolers, confirmation age, and they took their high schoolers to this cabin in the woods, January, February, March. And it was the tradition that you would go in the sauna, and then you would run down the steps to the lake where a hole had already been carved. You started your trip with carving the hole in the lake, and you would go down the ladder into the cold of the lake. Right? Anybody want to do it? No? So you can imagine I was 25 or so, and the new intern, and they were telling me all about these traditions, and you can imagine high school boys and girls, college boys and high school and junior high boys and girls. The competition that they were about, the excitement to see who could run down the fastest, jump in, and stay in as long as they could before they had to come up. And then you can imagine them saying, "Oh, Vic or Kim, you get to go in the ice hole too." There was no way I was not going in the hole in the lake. And I bring this up because that line that I read about joy in community, being together, caring for creation, it feels like a little bit of a microcosm of what it is to live in our faith. Because day in and day out, we're not jumping in a freezing cold lake. But sometimes our faith feels like we're called to do something that's uncomfortable, that puts us out of our comfort zone, right? You don't want to jump in a hole in a lake, do you? But there are things that you are called to do in your daily life that you don't want to do. Sometimes these calls get placed on us. Sometimes there's a diagnosis. Sometimes there's a fracture in a relationship. Sometimes it's just a change in your job, in your family status. You have a new kid. Some things call us out of ourselves to be uncomfortable, to be challenged. And yet, the lesson from the hole in the lake is that I was doing it in community. So can you picture, you can picture middle school kids, right? High school kids in a sauna, just, sweating, hot, laughing and giggling, saying, and they're scared too. The first time they go to the cabin, they've heard all the stories. They have known that this was what was going to happen when they went on their middle school retreat. And some of them are nervous, but they're not going to let on, are they? No. So there you are, you're in the sauna, and then all of a sudden it's time to go. And so one by one, you walk out, you walk down the stairs, into the cold, into the unknown. We're also doing this when it's dark. I mean, it's the whole thing. This is the scene is just full and ripe. And yet you jump in the water. You're refreshed. You're cleansed. And it's a church setting, but I can't help but thinking that this is what it is to jump into our faith and to jump in as we're baptized and reminded of our baptism over and over again, that a life of faith calls us to a bit of discomfort, and yet we do it together in community, and we come out renewed. We come out with a little bit of breath taken out of us, and yet we are with and surrounded by people who are calling it out of us and being together in community. And we're changed together. And so you have not raised your hand. You don't want to jump in a hole in a lake, but there is a prime example in my mind of how you, St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Cole Camp, Missouri, have done this within the last couple years, where you have stepped out of your comfort zone, where you've been challenged, where you did a hard thing together. Does anybody have a sense of what I'm talking about? It's a communal calling. Glenelly? The daycare. Yeah, the daycare, right? I mean, the history is there was a need. You had talked about it, probably. Other people in the community had talked about it. For years, Janice, I don't know. How many years had you talked about a daycare?
I would say more than 20.
More than 20, okay, right? And then suddenly, somebody, a group, you, the church, you needed to jump. You needed to do something uncomfortable. You needed to trust that you would come out okay, still trusting that you're going to come out okay. There was uncertainty, and yet we know the story because we're living it. September something, a daycare opened after years. So the challenge, the plunge was taken. And you all know what it is to have little kids. You can bet that there's been sickness, there's been bodily fluids, there's been things that have needed cleanup. There has been prayers about financial stability. There's been prayers, deep, abiding prayers for the families that have been coming, for their circumstances, for the hope that they need. And yet, St. Paul's has continued to jump, step out in faith, and come out transformed. Right? We're changed because, literally the building is different. We have to be stretched and creative in the ways we use the space. But we're transformed. And the story is still unfolding, right? But you all have jumped together in community and have come out transformed. And I think there's probably been a little bit of wrestling and wondering what the heck we're doing. And I want to go to today's gospel because the Pharisees, the text that I read, essentially they're calling Jesus in this gospel a chicken. Like the Pharisees come to Jesus with a concern. And they tell Jesus, Herod is coming for you. Basically, they're saying, well, you better run for it. We know Herod. You know Herod. And they're also thinking perhaps there's this implication underneath the words that you, Jesus, aren't really up to the task to stand up to Herod. So you better hide. You better leave your followers behind. It seems like they're calling him chicken, afraid of what is to come. And it's a taunt that they're doing. And we know from experiences that from childhood, perhaps now, it's easy to believe that we can be limited by the labels that people put on us. But then Jesus does something interesting with the Pharisees' taunts. Instead of rejecting them, Jesus claims the words and takes away the notion of their shame. If some would say Jesus is a chicken, then Jesus names Herod what other animal? A fox. Jesus names Herod a fox, which is also not a compliment. Because we know, you all know, a fox is a notorious enemy of the chicken, and not just because it's a predator, because a fox doesn't just kill when he's hungry. He will savage an entire hen house, killing indiscriminately and leaving the bodies behind. And so when Jesus calls Herod a fox, he is naming Herod a danger to everyone, including the Pharisees who are right before him. And you might think that this is a time when Jesus should go. Evacuate, time for the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all these scribes, the people who are studying the traditions and the Torah and the disciples, that they should run. But they can't all run. It's not an option for everybody. There's people who are poor, who are the ones being relied on for the livelihood for their families. There's people who are powerless and weak. And then there's Jesus. Jesus could get away. He's the Son of God. He could leave at any time. But Jesus doesn't. He says he isn't going anywhere. Jesus will continue his ministry regardless of the fox, regardless of the consequences. And this is what we see over and over again in our lives of faith, that we're called forward in ways that are uncomfortable, that are challenging. We're called into situations where people don't necessarily like what we have to say or how we're living and being in the world. We can be knocked down and called names. But Jesus uses this beautiful example, like the picture of the eagle, that Jesus will never leave his people. Jesus is willing to face the fox. Jesus will die for his people, and he will die for us, because that's what it takes to save us. Jesus will save us from the foxes of the world. Jesus saves us from their taunts and names. And Jesus doesn't do this by taking it away, right? We're still could be called names. We still face the challenges. We're still hurt in this world. But Jesus transforms them. And he does this by being with us as we move forward in faith and hope, as we jump, as we take challenges ahead of us. And so can you think in your name, what names were you called in elementary school? Maybe in college you had some names it was maybe just playful teasing, but did people call you something to your face, behind your back? Maybe they said something when they thought you weren't paying attention. And what did somebody tell you when you shared your dreams? When you said, hey, think about what we could do in this place, in this space. Think about how God is calling us. Did people laugh or say, no, we haven't done that. I don't know. It might be too hard. So now imagine this. In Jesus' life, he took on all of these names. He was poor. He was despised. He hung out with people of ill regard, which in his day was as bad as being one of them. If you're hanging out with the tax collectors, with the sinners, you were thought to be one of them, not welcome. And Jesus hung out with people too who were rich, who were powerful. And all of this lost him the support of the masses. So his association with all of the people who were on the outskirts, on the margins, this led to his end, where Jesus would die a lonely and humiliating death as an outsider. Right? We know the rest of the story that we're getting to at the end of Lent. We know how alone Jesus was, how battered and bruised he was. But here's the twist. He wasn't defeated. We know he rises again triumphant, proving the world wrong about who deserves God's love. He proves over and over again that there is no place where God won't go to be near us, and there is nothing that God can't redeem. And this is good news for us, because we have all stood on the margins in one way or another. We have lost, we have failed, we have sinned, we have wondered how to go on in the next day. Our lives may have seemed like a joke, but this doesn't stop Jesus from loving us and giving us a new start. And this is good news for us, because we're in a community that lives out this truth every day, that believes and proclaims Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection together, who sees a needs in a community and reaches out in love, and is reminded and reminds others that there is no place that God will not go to share God's love. Amen.